Sorry about that, I was muted. Hello. Today we are going to be saying the P word 5,000 times. I gotta make sure to I gotta share this stream. Gotta share the stream with my friends. Make sure you guys share the stream with your friends as well. I gotta. Yeah. All right. Gotta make sure I uh gotta post it to Twitter. I gotta post it to Twitter. I gotta post it to Twitter. Saying the P word 5,000 times. Wrong account. You know what? Whatever. You can post it to there. Are we ready? Yep, it's all thumbnailed, all ready to go. Okay. Poggers. 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 Poggers, 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 poggers. Whew, really taking the breath out of me. Poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. That is the first 100. That is 5% of the way there, I think. I don't remember. No, it's like who cares? Poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. 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 It's hard saying it like plural. I need to be able to see chat because I want to make sure I'm giving the best experience to my chat. You know what I mean? Fuck off. I need to make sure I can see chat, so I'm gonna like do this. How do I think I can do it like this. Yes. And let's expand this a bit more. Poggers. Poggers. 200 times. Poggers. Hey, Cosmic. Poggers. Okay, now we're 5% of the way there. I was dumb to say 100 was. Hey, Montgomery. You guys enjoying the stream so far? Poggers. Do you guys think I should keep it with the plural with the S? Because it's really making my mouth water when I like put the S. Should I just say wait, no, it shouldn't be allowed because the emote is called literally Poggers with an S, not Pogger. How unfortunate. Poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, dude. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Pogger, poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, poggers. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 pogger, poggers. You know, no, I don't want to copy that. Clear my status so it shows I'm not there. Oh, it doesn't even show I'm streaming. You know what? Whatever. Who cares? Because we all know I'm poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Hey, Shadox. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Ah, that's the right word. Poggers, 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 pogchamp, poggers, 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 poggers. Ugh, I'm already tripping on my words. Poggers. What? I can just press enter? Poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, 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 pogger, 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 poggers, 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 pogger. I keep saying Parkers. It's not the right word. Poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 pigger, pig, poggers, 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 not Parkers, poggers, 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 poggers. What's your guys' opinion on the word poggers? Like, honestly, it's such a good word, poggers. Poggers, poggers. I could say it 5,000 more times. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, 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 poggers! We reached 10%. We are 10% of the way there, boys. We are 10%. Poggers? Can we get some pog champs in chat? For anyone in chat right now, please, I beg, can we get some pog champs or poggers? I'd really appreciate it. Poggers, 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 pogger, 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 poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, 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 piggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Yeah, I can see why now dead friend Tide Detergent didn't like saying this. I am no, I mean he did, but he didn't really like doing this because I'm literally tripping over my words every 3 seconds. Poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, 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 boggers, no, poggers. Ooh, I'm getting shit in my throat. Poggers, 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 poggers. You know what? I'm at 600 now. I'm gonna grab my cup of water and take a nice good drink because my throat and my mouth is a bit weird, champ, if you know what I mean. Let me drink some water. some good fucking water, dude. I mean, it's from the tap, but water's water. You know what else is you know what to say about water actually now that I think about it. You know, it's pretty poggers, honestly. Like water is so poggers. Anyway, let's get back to it. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, poggers, pogger, poggers, 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 poggers. Pogger, 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 poggers. It literally doesn't even sound like a human word anymore. Poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, 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 poggers. We're closing up on a funny number. Poggers, 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 poggers. It's the funny number. Only Osu gamers will get this number. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, pogger, poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Ooh. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 no, poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, poggers, poggers. Am I even saying poggers anymore? Like, I don't even know at this point. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Thank you, Biscotti. Poggers, poggers. Can we get a pog champ in chat? Poggers, poggers. What do you mean restart? Funky, I'm not restarting. You can just. That's unpoggers, dude. That's so unpoggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Should I actually post this on Twitter? I'm on my main Twitter anyway. I posted it on my Osu account on accident. I'm gonna do that because it would be so poggers for like people to see how epic I am on my main. Let's go. Let's just post the link. Yes, post it on Twitter. Yes, thank you, Biscotti, for your support. I love you and appreciate you. That's my. Why is my Discord tag copied? Oh, right, because I accidentally pressed on it on Discord. Let me just I'm saying the P word 5,000 times. I think I can just. You know, I'm too scared to scroll through my pictures live, so I'm not going to. Let's close this. Make sure, guys, make sure to retweet that tweet, guys. Retweet. Anyway, back to it. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, 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 hey Lifey, poggers, 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 pogger, poggers, 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 poggers. I can't believe they made an emoji for the pogger emote. Fuck off. Poggers, 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 poggers. Lifey, excuse me. Poggers, 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 poggers. It's another funny number. Another funny number. Can we get a poggers in chat for that? Another funny number. Poggers, 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 Islam. What, Lifey, why are you putting Islam in chat? I'm very, a little bit concerned. Poggers, 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 poggers. And this is coming from the man saying poggers 5,000 times. Poggers, 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 poggers. I'm saying, why am I saying it without clicking? Why are you saying mashallah? Ugh. Stupid, what do they call? What is it called? I'm pretty sure there's some, I thought I knew some Islam like insults. I am fluent in Arabic. Got it. I can tell. I can tell. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 I meant sorry. Poggers, 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 poggers. Ah, poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. You're pogging out, dude. I'm so proud. I'm so proud to have you in my fan base, Shedox. Thank you for pogging out on my stream. Poggers, 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 poggers. Ooh, got a bit of phlegm in my throat again. Poggers, 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 fem. Why are you saying fem? Poggers, poggers, poggers. Kind of a weird champ thing to say, Shadox. Poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I don't even think I've ever like counted aloud like this much. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Ooh, that was a really good burp. Like poggers, dude. Poggers, 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 poggers. I really need to make this entertaining for myself because I'm going to fucking die of human boredom. Poggers, poggers, poggers. If I just keep only saying poggers. Sorry guys, I can't say just the word poggers for I said it. For literally 5,000 times in a row. It's just not humanly possible for me. Poggers. Poggers. I almost hit the reset button. Poggers. 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 What happens if I hit both enter keys on my keyboard at once? Poggers. Poggers? Yeah, it works. Poggers, 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 poggers. We are now, I think 30% of the way through. I think. I don't know. Poggers, 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 poggers. No, wait, it was 25%, I think. Yeah, it was 25. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 dude. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I'm still questioning what you meant by femme shadows. Poggers, 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 sponsored by Poggers Association. Ooh, that was a really nice burp. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I'm trying to go on my phone, but I really can't do that while clicking. Poggers, 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 poggers. I don't have good enough like of an ability to use my hand to my both of my hands separately. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. 30% of the way there. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 piggers, poggers, 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 poggers. Babe, your pussy is so poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 pogueres, 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 pogueres. Pogueres, 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 poggers, pogueres, poggers, pogueres, 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 poggers, pogueres, 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 pogueres. Pogueres, 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 porqueres, pogueres, 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 pore. What am I saying? Poggers? Poggers, 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 progress. Poggers, 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 no, that's not coggers. I meant to say poggers. 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 Poggers, 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 pogueiros, 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 babe, your pussy is so pogueiros, 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 poggers, poggers, pogger, pogger s, pogger s, poggers, 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 poggers. I ruined the 12,000 poggers. I'm so sad. Any 2001 gang? Anyone born in 2001? That would be so epic. Gotta make sure I self promote. I gotta self promote in here. What is this? What is the guy doing with his life? I just got recommended him saying the P word 5,000 times! Yeah, pug. I can't say that without the counter. Poggers, 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 poggers. Let me open this. Hick has willpower. Thank you, Montgomery. Poggers, 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 poggers. We are 2019, boys. Can we get a pogger in chat for the current year? I said poggers, and I ruined it. I said it again. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Really good burp. Poggers, 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 poggers. Thank you. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 dude, poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers? Poggers, 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 piggers, poggers. Pogueiros, 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 poggers, 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 poggers. I wonder if, like, I really hope the construction workers outside can't hear me. It'd be really weird, champ. I'm not gonna lie. Poggers, 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 Zoros. I'm not clicking on your message. I can just check my phone because in case if it's a NSFW, if you know what I mean. Poggers. Yeah, let's just check my phone. Poggers. I think it's safe. I think it's safe. Poggers. I think we can check it out. We can check it out. You know, that's pretty poggers. It's pretty. Gotta make sure the boys know. Make sure the boys know, if you know what I mean. So I said poggers. I don't know how many times I said poggers when I was not pressing the button, so I'm just not gonna press it. Poggers, 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 any poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 two, 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 two. That is a lot of poggers, if I'm being honest. But we're not even halfway there yet. Almost halfway there, but not quite. Poggers, 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 poggers. Thank you, Biscotti. I less than three. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. We are now 55. No, 45% of the way there. Poggers. Poggers, 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 you know, poggers, 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 pogger S, pogger S, pogger S, multiple poggers, multiple poggers, 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 stupid poger, pogger, pogger, poggers, 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 poggers. Is the guy who made the poggers face like, is he Asian? He looks kind of Asian. I'm not gonna lie. Asian poggers. I'm gonna search that up real quick because like, yeah, poggers guy. Is he Asian? Is there like Gutex PogChamp guy learns what poggers is? He didn't know what poggers is. He looks Asian, I'm not gonna lie. But that's just my opinion, and I apologize if it's the wrong opinion. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 pogueres, 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 poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 pogger, podges, pogues, 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 pogues. This is such a poggers moment. We are at 50. of the way now. We're halfway there. Like the song says, we are halfway there. Poggers, we're living on a prayer. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 pogger. Biscuity, I think you misspelled poggers. Here, I'll spell it for you. It's spelled like that. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Please get your spelling correct. I am really mad about that. I'm really disappointed in you. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, poggers. Poggers, poggers. Do I even have Steam open? We should play some Crush Crush, guys. We should play some Crush Crush on stream. No, we're not. We're not. We're not. We're not. Poggers, 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 poggers. Wait, poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Crush Crush is better than Blush Blush. Literally, there is voice acting in Crush Crush. Like, it is so amazing, so amazing. Poggers, poggers. It's so poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. What happened to the Osu content? I am an all-rounded YouTuber, Biscotti. I'll have you know. Poggers, poggers. You should watch my latest video, Biscotti. It's pretty quirky and pretty interesting, and you'd love it. I know you'd love it. You're really into I know you're really into music and all that. It's like you're very poggers about it. So I'm really just gonna use the word poggers to to say anything that's slightly like good. Poggers. Ooh, good poggers burp at this point because poggers. Um yeah, the less poggers I have to say in between my sentences, the better. Poggers, 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 pog gears, pog gears, pog gears, podgers, 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 pogers, 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 poggers, 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 poggers. What is this? I want to know. Is it important to me? Shut the fuck up, Zoros. Poggers, poggers, poggers. For fuck's sake, poggers, pogger. No! Ooga! What happened? Oh my god. That's so unpog. I'm gonna just go back to... I have to say it some more now. I know it was around there. Poggers, 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 poggers. No, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not restarting poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I literally refuse to restart, Biscotti. I'm literally going to just start from 2.7k. Poggers, 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 poggers. Jesus, that scared me. Poggers, 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 poggers. Let's see what this is. Fuck off, Shadox. Fuck off, Zoros. Thank you, Biscotti. That is very poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I didn't send it since its censors swear. Did you put the N-word? The only things I have censored are the N-word. And then like multiple variations of it. Poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. What do you mean you put the F word? You put fuck? Excuse me? I don't have that censored. Maybe you're just dumb. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. It censored it 4 times. Stop checking my messages and finish already. Oh, fuck you, Biscotti. Use chat, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. So I don't have to check. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Did my mouse double tap? Sorry about that. Poggers, 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 poggers. 60%, 60%. Oh no. I know where the original like thing is from. I know where that's from. I know where the dancing, I know where the original dance of that comes from, and I hate you. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Biscuity, would you say this stream is more interesting and entertaining than my normal Osu streams on twitch.tv/Hikai890FTW? Poggers, 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 poggers. Would you say it's more poggers? Poggers, 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 or anyone in the chat, really, to be honest. No? Damn, that hurt, man. But it's just such good, like, I'm so much better. Kekai, when's the next Fortnite stream? Yeah, Cosmic, when are you gonna make your next epic cover? Poggers, 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 poggers. Cosmic, if you snipe me in saying poggers more than me, by the way, if you snipe me, I will stream Fortnite. I will stream Fortnite with you. Poggers, 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 poggers. Oh yeah, he still has to play Osu with me. He still has to play Osu with me. Cosmic, no, not Cosmic. Cosmic isn't poggers. Like anti-poggers. Poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Biscuity, you're joining us. Biscuity, please join us for playing Osu, please. Poggers, 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 pogger. Unfortunately, I will not be joining you two while you play Osu. I hope you can understand and forgive me. I don't forgive you, Biscuity. Poggers, poggers, poggers. I say poggers 5,000 times, and you can't even play Osu with me? Unpoggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I feel burp coming on, but at the same time a yawn. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. You guys wanted pogist content, so here you go. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. How long have I been live now? 54 minutes. What the fuck? I've been saying poggers for the past hour. Poggers, 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 poggers. Why is this making me tired? Unpoggers, poggers, 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 a poggers, poggers, a poggers, poggers, a poggers, 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 poggers. Biscotti or anyone, if you can make a what's it called? A tongue twister with using the word poggers, put it in chat and I will attempt to do it. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Cause just saying poggers is so heart-wrenchingly boring. Surprisingly. Poggers, 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 poggers. That fucking scared me. Fuck you. Fuck you, Cosmic. Poggers, 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 poggers. You are. Good job. You are on stream. Thank you, Cosmic. Poggers, poggers. That further proves you have to play OC with me, by the way. Poggers, 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 poggers. You got the stream notif too. What? Steam notif. I'm retarded. Yeah, I got the Steam notif. Poggers, 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 poggers. Hey guys, don't let Kekai lie to you. This is a reincarnation of the N-word stream. What's the N-word stream? I've never heard of the N-word stream. Poggers, 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 poggers. I refuse. Cosmic, use the chat or you're balding. Poggers, 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 poggers. But if I block Cosmic, it'd be very unkeck of me. Block your mom. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. This is now 65%. I think. I think it's 65%. Or is it 70? It's 70. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, poggers. What does this mean? Live chat. I would love to see all messages more often than. Yeah, poggers, 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 poggers. How would top chat even work? Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I'm gonna grab more water. Not grab, but just drink. I have water, like, um, over here I can drink. Once again, that was some poggers water. That was some really Poggers water. Hey Google, have Alexa explain M theory to Siri and Watson using Cortana's Halo covenant and these quantum entangled strings or magic membranes from every reality in string theory, superstring theory. Love is not the satisfaction of a chemical reaction, but the sensation of neural networks, quantum entangled electromagnetic radiation. Is this a song or something? I have no clue. I'm sorry. I do not get the meme. Your joke has fallen flat on my face. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. We are 75% of the way there. What if you messaged me? I don't get the meme. I don't get the meme. I don't get the meme. I don't get the meme, Biscotti. That is unfunny. Poggers, 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 poggers. And this is coming from the man, the myth, the legend, saying poggers 5,000 times. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. My brain is malfunctioning. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Hey, Calathis. Poggers, 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 poggers. I am saying poggers 5,000 times, Calathis. Poggers, 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 poggers. I will not stop. Poggers, 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 poggers. It is my job to finish this, Calathis. I am showing that I am dedicated. I am a dedicated human being, and I can dedicate myself to anything. From Osu plays to me just saying poggers 5,000 times. I think I've been live for like an hour now. Let me check. An hour and 3 minutes. Yeah, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. And why dedicate yourself to saying poggers, sir? Well, so there's a very good reason. There's an old video from an old friend of mine who is no longer on the internet named Tide Detergent, where he did the same thing, but instead of saying poggers, he said the N-word. So I'm gonna one up him, poggers, and yeah, basically I'm one upping him without saying the N-word. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. At the eve of my creation, when my father's atoms from his serpent or sperm merge and take a bite out of my mom's egg, the forbidden apple, and my halo is formed for this energy transfer. Jesus, that burp was terrible. Poggers, 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 poggers. Babe, your pussy is so poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Posers, 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 poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Can you guys guess what's next? That is right. PogChamp. Poggers, 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 poggers. We are now 80% of the way there. We are 80% of the way there. I have 1,000 more poggers to say before I am done. Are you ready, lads? Are you ready for the final stretch? The final moments. Someone tell Austin. Someone tell Austin. He'd be very thrilled to hear about this. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers to you, Biscotti. I love you as much as poggers, 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 poggers to you, Biscotti. Poggers, 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 poggers. Stupid pogger. Poggers, 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 pogger, poggers. I meant. Sorry about that. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 I meant to say. Oh, my jaw is literally like fucking hurting. Not hurting, but like it's just kind of it's not chilling, that's for sure. Poggers, poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. I forget what percent is 250 of 5,000. Four times 4 times fucking 5, 20, 1/20th. What? Oh well. Oh, I keep burping. Poggers, 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 poggers. Poggers, 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 piggers, poggers, 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 pogueres, 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 pogueres. Babe, your pussy is so pogueres. Pogueres, 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 pogueres. Pogueres, 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 pogueres. Pogues, pogues. Poggers, poggers. Poggers, 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 poggers. We are now 95. I think it's 95. If I recall properly. No, it is 90%. It is 90% of the fucking way there. We're almost done. Poggers, 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 pogger, not poggers, 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 burgers, 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 poggers, 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 bug, not baka, bakaero, ie. Poggers, 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 poggers. We have 100 more poggers to say, boys. And as a special referendum, I'm gonna join General 1 and do it live. Poggers, 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 poggers,
I'm still
poggers,
watching.
poggers, poggers,
Dude, the
poggers, 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 poggers,
No.
poggers, poggers,
No.
poggers, 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 poggers,
Boogers.
poggers, 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 poggers,
Shut the
poggers,
fuck up.
poggers, 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 poggers,
Dude, are
poggers,
you-
poggers, poggers,
Are you
poggers,
saying
hope you
poggers
die.
without consent?
Poggers, 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 poggers. 50 more poggers!
Yes, I get to hear them live. The
Poggers,
last
poggers,
50.
poggers, poggers,
Yes.
poggers, poggers, poggers,
Yes.
poggers, poggers, poggers,
I'll say them with you.
poggers, 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 poggers. Babe, your pussy is so poggers, poggers,
Pussy,
poggers.
pussy, pussy,
Poggers.
pussy.
Yeah,
Poggers,
on the last one,
poggers,
scream it.
poggers,
On the last
poggers,
one, scream
poggers,
it.
Poggers, 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 poggers!
Yay!
Hey.
Happy birthday to poggers.
My brain. My
Happy
fucking...
birthday to you.
Oh my
Happy
god. How
birthday,
did that
the
fucking
poggers.
Tide
Like
guy...
the post guy was browsing Reddit and he
How
just
did that fucking Tide guy do this shit? Holy shit.
it's a little thing called charisma on command.
Charisma on
Shut up.
fucking
Shut up.
command. Shut
I
up.
look I have charisma on command.
Remember when I talked about that guy?
Yeah.
Like
I don't.
so much.
Ah! I'm done. Goodbye, stream. Goodbye, stream. Suck my cock. Sponsored by.
Saying the P word 5,000 times. What, you're
Please.
streaming?
Yeah, I was streaming this the whole time.
Yeah, idiot. What are you, wacko?
All right.
What are you, wacky?
Oh,
What are you,
Anrai
silly?
showed up right in
Go!
time. Thanks for showing up, Anrai. Bye bye.
Oh my
Oh,
god,
check
you were
out my new
doing this for
video.